Hey guys, Bunny Pounds, Christians Engaged, honored to be with you this summer as we relive some of the messages from our last year's conference with Christians Engaged. What an incredible time we had last year. Really, this conference every year is like a homecoming. It's just awesome to see you all. If you've been affected by the work of our ministry, we would love to invite you to come join us August 8 and 9 in Dallas, Fort Worth. Literally, guys, you're paying for the box lunch on Saturday. That's it. We're pretty much offering this conference for free this year because we want to fill up the auditorium as we're re-recording our On-Ramp to Civic Engagement class. So you're going to get to be a part of the studio audience as we record that for the coming years. This message today that we're replaying is by Tim Barton, WallBuilders. Tim is the son and the new president of WallBuilders. He's the son of David Barton, an incredible American historian that we love. We so appreciate all of David's work and Tim's work on the founding fathers, on American history and American heritage, and our Christian roots in this country, actually. Tim's message at this conference is just so inspiring because he details out quotes from George Washington, John Adams. He talks about how we have to go now on the offense because so many things have happened. We can put up In God We Trust now again. Commandments can go back up in schools. You know, so often in the body of Christ, we sit and we're always playing defense against the radical left. But now we can go on the offense and we can push faith because it's historically based in our public institutions. You're going to love this message by Tim Barton. It was one of the buzzes around the conference last year, and it's going to bless you. So stick around. Here at Christians Engaged, we are on a quest to see every American Christian take stewardship of their life, their nation, and this generation. Can you imagine a world where every Christian in this country did three simple things? Pray, vote, and engage. And what if we did those ongoing? It would totally shift our nation. That's what we're doing here at Christians Engaged. Over the last 5 years, we've built a standing army of Christians that are saying, I want to pray, vote, and engage ongoing and be leaders in my community. We're just getting started, folks. Here at Conversations with Christians Engaged, join us every week as we take you in depth in interviews with government officials, ministry leaders, subject leader experts to awaken and empower you to do those three things ongoing. I'm Bunny Pounds. I'm the president and founder of Christians Engaged. I spent 16 years in political consulting working for members of Congress and other candidates before starting this ministry. And my co-host, Ben Quine, our biblical worldview expert and our vice president. Come on a journey with us every week. We're here to help you pray, vote, and engage.
Well, it is my pleasure to be with you. I want to tell some stories of American history. I want to help connect some dots on what we can do in culture and encourage and challenge a little bit. I want to start with a letter from John Adams in 1813. He was writing to, at that point, one of his, again, friends, Thomas Jefferson, and he was reminding him of what they had done nearly 40 years earlier in kind of the Revolution founding era. And he's looking back and says, man, remember when we were together early on? And it was hard. There was so much disagreement. We were coming from so many different places. He said, we found common ground. We pulled this thing off. Well, part of what he wrote in the letter where they found common ground, he said, the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Now, it's interesting that as they were looking for common ground, the place he identified they found common ground were the principles of Christianity. Now, why I think that's really cool and kind of interesting is because in our modern era, we generally hear the founding fathers were not religious, or we hear about separation of church and state. And I guarantee you, the students that are in public school today are learning very negative things about the founding fathers, not the least of which being that they were irreligious, atheists, agnostics, and deists. But in previous generations, they used to study history and not just listen to what some professor wrote or what some modern academic says. And actually, there was a professor at Duke University. Her name was Alice Baldwin. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, she was at Duke University. But in 1928, she wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. And in this book, she identified that every single issue found in the Declaration had first been preached by pastors in American pulpits prior to 1763, concluding that when the founding fathers got together and they're discussing all of their ideas for independence and all of the problems we have with the king, everything they discussed, she identified it wasn't their unique ideas they were presenting. They were repeating what they had learned from their pastors over the previous several decades. Now, why this is interesting, in her book, she actually identifies not only the pastor, but the sermons in which they dealt with those issues and topics. So she's able to track this back and identify it. Now, part of why this matters in modern context is because when the modern narrative is, the founding fathers weren't religious, they didn't believe in God, but then you see that the ideas they got were from their pastors, which also just is an interesting contrast from where most pastors are today, right? That most pastors don't want to deal with the controversial issues. They don't want to offend people, et cetera, et cetera. No, back then, they were calling it out. That's what the word of God says, what the king's doing. He's totally wrong. That's what we should be doing. Well, if you look at the founding fathers, most people don't think of the founding fathers as being mentored or influenced by their pastors, but it really does show just how little of their stories we actually know. For most people, if we said the names George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, we would all know those names. But if I said, tell me a story about them, we would have a hard time coming up with many stories. And the problem is the familiarity with the name has led us to the assumption that we know much more than we actually do. Most people don't know that much of the story, and if we did, we would know why people like Alice Baldwin could so accurately say these people were more influenced by their pastors than anybody else. Part of the reason we can know that historically, the very first time the founding fathers ever met was September 6, 1774. The very first motion made, John Adams says Thomas Cushing of Massachusetts made the very first motion that they open with prayer. There was then a painting done depicting that first prayer meeting. This is the painting depicting the very first time the founding fathers got together in their opening prayer. Now, John Adams, one of the guys who was there, wrote Abigail 11 days after this happened and said, Abigail, it was amazing. He identified the opening prayer lasted for nearly 2 hours. Now, I love Jesus a lot. But if I showed up to a political meeting and they're like, we're just praying the next 2 hours, I'd be like, whew, I would need to mentally prepare just a little bit, right? We hang out, Jesus, we talk all the time, but 2 hours is a long time. Well, this isn't like these were the spiritual leaders. These were the political leaders, but this is how significant their faith was. In fact, one of the things that happened during that 2 hours of prayer is it was suggested they should read from the Bible. And so they opened up the Book of Common Prayer, which was an Anglican prayer book written back in the mid-1600s. And in it, it would have prescribed verses ascribed for every single day, and it would get you through the Bible in a year. Well, there were 4 chapters ascribed for them that day. And John Adams writes to Abigail, says, Abigail, you got to read what we read. He said, of the verse, he said, one of them, he says, it was as if God himself had ordained that passage to be read. One of the other founding fathers wrote that that passage was accidentally extremely applicable to their situation. That God really spoke to us. Well, here's part of the letter he wrote to Abigail. He said, I must beg you to read that psalm, read the 35th Psalm to your friends, read it to your father. Her father was the Reverend John Smith, the pastor of their home church. And so John Adams saying, Abigail, everybody needs to read this. Well, what is Psalm 35? Psalm 35 is one of the Psalms David wrote while he's running from King Saul. And he cries out to God and says, God, I've done nothing. And yet he seeks my destruction. Lord, you rise up, be my shield, my buckler, my strong right arm. On he goes for more than 30 verses. And the founding fathers, when they read this, they're like, this is us. This is so us right now. We are David and the British are Saul. Well, it's probably also worth noting that they had found out that morning that the night before the British had surrounded Boston Harbor and their ships had begun cannonading and destroying the homes in Boston. And so maybe that actually even makes more sense why somebody's like, hey, I think we should pray. Let's talk to God about this. But then as they're praying and they read the Bible and they're like, Psalm 35, this is amazing. Well, it doesn't stop there because John Adams then writes Abigail another letter and he tells her what else Congress did. Now, this is one of the first moves Congress makes. He says, we've appointed a continental fast. One of the first things Congress does as a group of founding fathers coming together in this nation is they call for a day of prayer and fasting for all the colonies. And this is part of what John wrote to Abigail. He said, millions to be upon their knees at once before their great creator, imploring his forgiveness and blessing, his smile on American council and arms. Now, when John Adams says millions are to be upon their knees at once, there's only about 3 million colonists. So John Adams is like, everybody's going to pray. we're all gonna, that's probably naively ambitious, right? I don't know that every American prayed, but this also says something about what they viewed of the culture and Christianity at that time. That if there's a call to pray, well, of course, we all know God, we're all gonna pray. This is something that Congress did. This wasn't the first, the only, or the last time. When you look at these calls to prayer, by the time you get to 1815, there had been more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations done by governors, by presidents, or by Congress. Now, this is one of the favorite stats I like to point to when somebody says, oh, the founding fathers weren't religious, or separation of church and state, whatever it is. I just wanted to say, okay, if they weren't religious, why did they pray all the time? Right? Because, I mean, let's logically think through this. If you're an atheist, you believe there is no God. If you're an agnostic, you say, I'm not really sure if there's a God. If you're a deist, you say there is a God, but he doesn't get involved in the world. If you're an atheist, agnostic, or deist, you know what you're never doing? That, right? Not even one time, right? They did it 1,400 times. And if you're not real good at math, to get to 1,400 by 1815, that means you had to pray a lot every year. That's the math on that, okay? This is the founding fathers. Well, the first time it happened for the founding fathers was in the American Revolution. Well, they did 15 of these in the Revolution. And there were two kinds of prayer proclamations. It was one for prayer and fasting, and this was what this first one was. And this was also logical. If they needed God's intervention, they would have a time of prayer and fasting. And then several months later, they would do one for prayer and thanksgiving where they would say, you know, all those things we prayed and asked God to help with, we should go back and thank God for how God intervened on our behalf. Well, this is what they did back and forth 15 times during the American Revolution. The first one was for prayer and fasting, and it wasn't very long after this that John Adams actually wrote Abigail another letter. He said, Abigail, he said, we are already seeing incredible things. And in this letter, he goes through and says, the British attacked the fort, and our militia repelled them, and they attacked the town, and the men of the town repelled them. And he goes through all of these unlikely things. But my favorite part of this letter, he says, we just destroyed a 64-gun British man of war ship and a 20-gun British man of war ship. Now, those are British naval vessels that had 64 cannons and 20 cannons. Now, this is significant to understand in American history. We had been British colonies up until like that moment. When we separate from Great Britain, we don't have a navy. They were our navy, right? Because we were them. Great Britain was the number one military power in the world. The reason they're the number one military power in the world is because they have the number one navy in the world. We didn't have any kind of naval vessels. Now, we did have some business owners in America, and they did own ships they would use for trading. So we took whatever boats we had. We would take whatever cannons we could find. We'd put the cannons on the boats, and we would try to fight back. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum of American History, up on the third floor, they have one of the very first ships of the American Navy. It's called the gunboat Philadelphia. This is the gunboat Philadelphia. When John Adams is like, Abigail, it's amazing. We just destroyed a 64-gun British man of war ship and a 20-gun British man of war ship. My question is, how? Did you row really fast in their direction? Because that's like a rowboat, right? This is crazy. And this was the point. They looked and they were like, this is so crazy. Like, it doesn't even make sense. John Adams wrote Abigail another letter. Says, Abigail, I was eating dinner tonight, and there were men at a table eating dinner behind me, and they were discussing all of these unlikely things we've been seeing happen. And they were trying to figure out, how do we best explain this? And they came up with an explanation that I think is the best explanation I've heard at this point of what's actually going on. Here's what the explanation was. It appears to me the eternal Son of God is operating powerfully against the British nation. So they're discussing, and they're like, how did this happen? And somebody's like, oh, I know. It's Jesus. That's how it happened, right? But keep in mind, for this to be the most likely explanation, that did not come from an atheist, agnostic, or deist. That didn't come from separation of church and state. That didn't come from we don't want God to be a part. That came from someone who knew we were never going to succeed without God's intervention. And so when we see these unlikely things happening, we better make sure we acknowledge where it's coming from. This is the general sentiment. And by the way, I don't have time to go through in the American Revolution. There are dozens of examples where God divinely protected and people should have died and been captured and hung and killed and all this kind of stuff. And God protected so much. Well, by 1778, and this is still kind of early Revolution period, but George Washington wrote General Thomas Nelson Jr. a letter. And he said, it's so obvious that God is working on our side. Here's part of what he wrote in the letter. The hand of providence has been so conspicuous in this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. Washington is acknowledging, right? God has been so obvious. If anybody sees what we've been seeing and they can't acknowledge that God's been moving on our behalf, then they must be worse than a non-believer or more than wicked if they can't acknowledge it's God who's been doing this. Well, his letter didn't stop there. The next line is my favorite. But it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases, and therefore I shall add no more on the doctrine of providence. Washington's like, I've seen enough miracles, I could become a pastor. But for right now, I'm going to try to win this war, right? Like, this is his sentiment. This is the way it was through the entire revolution. By the way, in Washington's letters alone, George Washington wrote on more than 250 occasions about God's providence in the American Revolution. Okay? So when people talk about the founding fathers not being religious or God not being a part, you just clearly have not read very many of their writings. Because this is all over their writings. Well, when the revolution finally ends, 1783 is when the Peace Treaty of Paris is signed. These are the three Americans that represented and went and signed that peace treaty. On the left is John Jay, in the middle is John Adams, on the right is Benjamin Franklin. The peace treaty that ended the American Revolution is still on display in Washington, D.C. today. It's in the State Department. It's up on the 6th floor, known as the John Quincy Adams State Drawing Room. If you look at the left, on the top, you see there's Article 10, because there's 10 articles. Bottom left, you see the signatures. David Hartley's with the blue ribbon. He was a British ambassador. Then John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. The one that's kind of just out of reach is John Jay. What is significant about this? This is the document that ended the revolution. It brought peace between America and Great Britain. It established America as a free and independent nation. Notice the title of the document. In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. You know, America became a nation in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's literally on the document. That is the weirdest title for a peace treaty I've ever seen. Why would you do that? Well, it's possible somebody had read Proverbs 3 that morning. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your step. I mean, they're acknowledging him on the very top of the document. This is the kind of stuff that when you actually study the history and see the documents, read the letters, it actually makes sense why John Adams would remind Jefferson it was the principles of Christianity. Like that's how we pulled this off. That's how we did what we did. And if you go even further, when George Washington became president, at the end of his 2 terms, he delivered what's considered the most significant political address ever given, known as his farewell address. In his farewell address, he was giving advice on how America could succeed in the future going forward. And part of what he wrote in the farewell address, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, let's point out, political prosperity is how a nation succeeds. Okay, so if a nation is going to succeed, that's what we're talking about. He says of all of the things we could do to help a nation or America succeed, religion and morality are indispensable supports. If you've never read the farewell address, I encourage you to go read it. It's quite remarkable. He gives so much good advice. He talks about avoiding foreign entanglements and avoiding debt. He talks about making sure that we prioritize principle over a love of party. So much good advice. But if you read it, there's only one time he said something is indispensable. Indispensable means you can't do it without it. The only thing he said was indispensable was religion and morality. Now, religion and morality, also to be very clear, if you go back and study the founders' writings, anytime they talk about religion in this kind of context, they're talking about Christianity. This wasn't ambiguous. They were very clear. It's Christianity. Morality were the morals outlined in the Bible. What Washington is saying is without Christianity in the Bible, this whole thing is not going to work. He continued, in vain would that man claim a tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Meaning if you're against religion and morality, you don't love America. The following year, John Adams became president. John Adams, the next year, wrote a letter to the militia of Massachusetts, and the letter is great. It's like 4 paragraphs, maybe even 3. It's not very long, very easy to read, and the whole thing is brilliant. I'm just going to quote one excerpt. You've probably heard it before, where he says, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Now, why would he say that? Our Constitution was built on the premise of giving freedom to people. But freedom only works if you have a moral people. If you give freedom to immoral people, it looks like Chicago every weekend, which is not good, right? Freedom only works when you have a religious and moral people. Religious is Christianity, moral is the Bible. Freedom only works when you have people that are grounded in the principles of Christianity, right? Outlined in the Bible. That is what allows freedom to function and operate. And this is the way America was built. It's the reason the Bible was the number 1 textbook used in schools. The Bible was always a part. Faith was always a part of our foundation. It really wasn't until the 1960s when the U.S. Supreme Court took a totally different approach without historic precedent. And you can actually go back and read their decisions. The Engel versus Vitale decision, they made this decision, they say, without any historic precedent. Well, what decision did they make? They said it was no longer constitutional for students to pray at school. Without historic precedent, they said. We have no thing we're basing this on except we shouldn't do this. And they're the ones that really popularized the phrase separation of church and state. The following year, you had a dual decision. It was Abington, Shimp, and Murray Curlett, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, yeah, no more Bible in school either. And ironically, when the Supreme Court delivered this decision, in their written decision, they actually quoted a psychologist as part of the reason they had to remove the Bible, and their reason was about how dangerous the Bible was. Let me read you part of this decision. If portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. So if a student were to read the Bible and there wasn't a pastor there to explain it to him, it might cause brain damage. Now, this is stupid on lots of levels. But let me start with the easy one. They said the New Testament might impact kids. I feel like you might not be familiar with the other part. Because if there's anything that's going to traumatize kids, it's not in the new part, right? I mean, let's be clear about this. This was the bias. And yet, when you read their decision, the reason they said it might traumatize kids, the 2 things they cite were Jesus might be offensive to those that don't believe in Jesus. And the second thing they said is the Bible and the New Testament also talks about the terrors of hell, and we wouldn't want children to be terrorized of hell. And I was like, I do. Like, yeah, nobody should want to go there. You should think that's a scary place. Right. You don't want to do that. Jesus and hell was the reason they said no more Bible in schools, and this laid a foundation for the change. By the way, this was the beginning. Over the next several decades, the Supreme Court made a lot of these crazy decisions. In fact, in 1971, they were dealing, the Lemon v. Kurtzman decision, they were dealing with the question of how do we know then what's even constitutional and what's not? Because if the Bible and prayer aren't constitutional, what else can we do? And from this Lemon v. Kurtzman decision, they came up with what was known as the Lemon test. And the Lemon test was a 3-pronged decision, but the essence of the Lemon test was that if you are doing any religious activity, it's only constitutional if you are doing that activity for a primarily secular purpose. What? You can only be religious if it's not for religious reasons. Then why would I want to do that? But this was their argument. In fact, they began passing decision after decision that way. It wasn't literally until just a couple of years ago, largely because we had a former president who appointed several new justices. We had a new makeup of the Supreme Court, and they found this really cool old document called the Constitution. And they read it, and they were like, hey, that's not what this says. And let me walk you through the sequence, because most Americans have no idea how significant the change is that we now have opportunities to do things we've never been able to do in our lifetime. In 2019, there was a Bladensburg Cross decision. It's a World War I memorial cross. At the end of World War I, a group of mothers got together, they raised the money, and they erected this cross to their sons who were killed in World War I. Well, a couple years ago, There was an atheist walking by, saw the cross, got offended. The Supreme Court went back, or actually it was lower courts first, made its way to the Supreme Court. Lower courts went back and reviewed it, and they said, well, these mothers erected it, but they were clearly religious. Dedication was religious, so they erected this for religious reasons. That is actually a violation of the Lemon decision. So, because they were being religious for religious reasons, so that's unconstitutional. So the lower court said, we have to tear down this World War I memorial. Fortunately, it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court looked at it, and they were like, that's crazy. We're not tearing down a World War I memorial. Part of the decision they released and why this was constitutional to remain standing, they said, long-standing religiously expressive monuments, symbols, and practices require a strong presumption of constitutionality. That's part of their written decision. Meaning, if there's something we've always done, it's probably okay. That was their idea. Now, that shifted significantly the idea of what is constitutional and what's not. Because now we're not saying, well, if you're not doing it for secular reasons, no, now we're saying if there's a historic precedent. Well, you know what there's historic precedent for? All kinds of stuff. Well, this was the beginning. This was 2019. Then in 2022, there was another chink in the armor, and this is from the ripple effect of that Bladensburg Cross decision. There was a city of Boston, had 3 flagpoles flying in front of the city, and one was the American flag, one was a city flag, and the third flagpole, they would allow people from the city to come and fly whatever flag they wanted to. The city flew over 200 flags and only told one group no. There was a group of Christians, and they wanted to fly a Christian flag. And they said, oh, you can't fly the Christian flag. Why? Because you want to do it for religious reasons, and that violates the Lemon decision. This was a shirtlift versus city of Boston. Also, interesting, it was a 9-0 decision from the current Supreme Court, or relatively current, when they said, the city of Boston, you are totally wrong. Justice Stephen Breyer is a liberal justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and Justice Breyer, he explained, you're citing the Lemon decision, which was bad from the very beginning. This is liberal justice saying this. It was bad from the very beginning. Here's part of his written decision. He said the Lemon decision was issued during a bygone era when this court took a more free-willing approach to interpreting legal texts. He concluded that era is now over, saying we're not doing that anymore. Well, the straw that broke the camel's back, you already know the story. Our friends over at First Liberty, as they had this case, right? You don't need the details of Coach Joe because you've already heard it, and hopefully you'll see the movie in about a month. But as this all unfolds, the only reason he was fired was because of the Lemon decision. This makes it the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court says, okay, you know what? Not only are we reinstating him and all that entails, but we are now forever removing Lemon. Forever. Why does that matter? Not just for the good news of hey, no. If you go back and study for the last 51 years leading into this, approximately 7,300 times, federal courts had used Lemon to stop religious activity, to say it was unconstitutional. Okay, well, if Lemon's now overturned, you know what that means? There's 7,300 opportunities to restore religious faith in America. So what do we do now? Well, one of the things the Bible tells us. In Proverbs, it says that a wise man attacks the city of the mighty and tears down the stronghold. What does that mean? It means a wise man actually plays a little offense. If all we do, and we have been so bad as conservatives and Christians about this for decades. If all you do is play defense, all you do is lose more slowly. At some point, you got to get the ball and go the other direction. There's never been more or better opportunities than right now. Now, First Liberty is the one that actually had all 3 of those decisions. They had all 3 of those cases, and they have a website called Restoring Faith in America. Would highly encourage you to check out that website because they outline where are areas we can push back and restore some of these things that's lost. But let me just walk you through a couple really quick as we wrap this up before lunch. The 10 Commandments is a great example. If you are not familiar, earlier this year, Louisiana passed a law. Governor Landry signed it that in Louisiana, the 10 Commandments will now be reinstated in every single public school classroom in the state. Because the only reason they were removed in 1980 with Stone v. Graham, the Lemon test was used to say, hey, we're not putting these up for non-religious reasons. It's clearly religious, so we have to remove them. 10 Commandments can now go back. Imagine the change it would be if every public school student in the nation was learning things like honor your father and mother. Well, that might solve some of the gender confusion as well, right? There's a mom and there's a dad, right? Family units, important. Don't murder. Don't steal. I mean, how might things change just by reminding kids there's a God, he's got standards? Well, it goes even further than that. Because memorial crosses, we were being told that whether they be in city cemeteries or federal property or in city parks, you can't have these kind of memorials. Memorial crosses are now legal anywhere we want to put crosses. We can put crosses up. Also, every single government meeting, whether it be a school board, whether it be a city council, a mayoral, a governor, any kind of public city meeting can now open with prayer. We can once again bring God back into the equation. Similar, looking at nativity scenes. It used to be that nativity scenes were prominent in every Christmas. Nativity scenes were there. We were told initially you can't have nativity scenes because you're only doing it for religious reasons. And so Christians made a compromise. And part of the compromise was you're allowed to put up nativity scenes as long as there are as many non-nativity items like your Rudolphs, right? Like your other things, your snowmen, whatever else. Because then you can say, well, it's just a Christmas celebration. I'm not anti like Saint Nick. I'm not anti Rudolph. But maybe it's time that we once again just go back and remind kids the reason for the season, right? Maybe back in our city library, maybe back on our courthouse, maybe back in our school libraries or in front of our schools. By the way, also, kids were told you can't sing certain carols because they talk about Jesus. You're allowed to sing carols that talk about Jesus because he's actually the reason for the season. That's what Christmas is all about. Those are now legal again. The same thing within God We Trust displays that can go up. And actually, a lot of counties, a lot of states have already done this, started embracing this and working to get this done in all 50 states. But it's interesting, if you go back and read Romans, one of the things that God acknowledged, the reason that people's hearts turned so badly against him is they did not recognize God as God. Well, even reminding, right, just having kids see this, in God we trust, there is a God, right? Government's not God, you're not God, there's an actual God. What a novel thing to go back to. And even the idea of student-led prayer, every single day at public school can open with prayer. Every single sporting event can open with prayer. As long as a student leads it, we can restore prayer back in public schools. Similarly, we can have the Bible back in schools. The Bible can be taught in public schools where it is the only textbook in that class. And even if we want to teach the Christian heritage of America, those are now legal to do in the nation. Also, even the idea of science. According to the modern Supreme Court interpretation, you can give as much time studying creation as evolution because you're giving equal treatment to the options of maybe where the universe came from. So every high school science teacher, we can talk about God and the origin of the universe. And by the way, all of these things, you can be defended and represented for free by some amazing organizations out there if people just had the courage to do it. And there's more than 7,300 opportunities to restore this. So what should we do? It's time for us to roll up our sleeves and play some offense. Okay? As Christians, we've been praying for the days we are now living in. We've been praying for these days. But too many people are getting discouraged. They're being disappointed. They want to stay home. They don't want to be a part of it because there's a fight and there's a struggle. Yeah, there's always going to be a fight and a struggle. Guess what? When Jesus comes back, he's bringing a sword. There's going to be a fight and there's going to be a struggle. There's always a fight and a struggle. But if only one team shows up to play the game, I know who's going to win. It's time that Christians, we recognize we've never had a better opportunity to do this in right now in our nation. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's get back to work. Let's make a difference. God bless you guys.
We are so thankful for David and Tim Barton, for WallBuilders, all the things they've invested in our lives as believers. I know Ben Quine, our vice president, and I have both been highly affected by this ministry. We're so thankful for Tim joining us at our national conference last year and being an ongoing partner with us on so many things. You know, God is moving in our nation, and there are so much that we need to do together. One of the things we're trying to do is raise up the next generation of leaders with our courses and our educational products. On-Ramp to Civic Engagement is our signature class. It's the first class we tell everybody to take And we're re-recording it this year in Dallas-Fort Worth, August 8 and 9 at Create Church. We want to see you in the studio audience. We'd love to have you be a part of this amazing weekend. Grab a flight, grab a bus, get in your car, drive to Dallas-Fort Worth, grab a hotel, come be a part wherever you are around Texas, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Nebraska. We'd love to see you. Come on in. We'd love to see you in Dallas-Fort Worth, August 8 and 9. Register today at our website at christiansengage.org. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible program today. We are so happy to be in your life. Have you shared this? Have you subscribed? Have you reviewed our podcast? Please share this with other people and help us get the word out that Christians are getting empowered around this nation. Step 1 to join Christians Engage is take our pledge to pray, vote, and engage on our website at christiansengage.org. Every week, we'll teach you how to pray for government. We will send voting reminders around every election, and we'll help you engage more for America. Step 2, take one of our classes. Have you taken our On-Ramp to Civic Engagement or Biblical Worldview or the Leadership of Nehemiah or Biblical Conduct? We have so many classes, including a full campaign school that you can plug into right now on our classes page. Step 3, hey, it's time to get involved in campaigns, advocacy, registering more Christian voters, activating your church. Every Christian needs to get off the sidelines and make a difference. We are here to mentor you into your place of leadership. That's what we do every day at Christians Engage. So reach out to us for help in any of those areas. And lastly, everybody listening to me right now can help fund a movement of millions of Christians that will pray, vote, and engage ongoing. We're supported by people just like you that every month or every year invest in this ministry, their hard-earned dollars, their treasure, their heart. We thank you so much. Please be a part and give at christiansengage.org. Thank you so much to our partners at The Stream. Thanks for sharing this podcast every week. We so appreciate you. Also, Edify app with Christian Post. Thank you for having us part of your podcast ministries. Christians Engage is a ministry of Family Policy Alliance Foundation, and together around the country, we are mobilizing Christians to pray, vote, and engage. We love you. We'll see you back next week.